You've got one shot to make this right. Officer David Hunt muttered to himself, pacing back and forth in the sterile, dimly lit office. He was on the verge of executing the perfect plan to bring down Judge Ava Turner, a black federal judge with an impeccable reputation. He knew it would be easy. After all, no one would suspect a thing. Or so he thought. Ava Turner was more than just a judge. She was a woman who had climbed from the depths of prejudice and hardship, with a determination to seek justice no matter the cost. But tonight, the cost would be higher than she could imagine. As she left her courtroom that evening, tired from a long day of legal battles, she had no idea that someone had already decided her fate. In the quiet corners of the courthouse, David Hunt was waiting, ready to strike. He had carefully planted the drugs in her car, ensuring that it would be an open and shut case. As the hours passed and the night deepened, he couldn't help but smile to himself. Ava would be framed, her reputation shattered, her career ruined. No one could outsmart him. No one had ever dared. But Ava wasn't like the others. She wasn't afraid. When David pulled her over the next morning, his heart raced, but not with fear. He knew it was only a matter of time before everything fell into place. He approached her car, the smell of his own arrogance thick in the air. "Step out of the vehicle," David ordered, his voice steady, but his hands trembling slightly. Ava obeyed, her eyes focused and sharp as ever. "What's going on, officer?" she asked, though she already knew. He gestured toward the back seat, where the bag of drugs sat, perfectly placed for the world to see. "You're under arrest for possession," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. Ava's eyes flickered with recognition, but there was no panic, no sign of weakness. Instead, she stood tall, looking him dead in the eyes. "You're making a mistake, Officer Hunt," she said, her tone calm, measured, and unwavering. He couldn't help but smirk. She had no idea what was coming. But Ava Turner was no stranger to injustice. She had faced it all her life, and now, she would fight back. As the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists, she remained silent, her mind already working through the steps of what she would do next. The moment would come when David would realize that his plan had been a mistake. He was the one who would be caught, and the world would watch as the very system he had tried to manipulate turned on him. And when that moment came, it would be Ava Turner who would have the last word. The room was silent, a suffocating tension hanging in the air as Judge Ava Turner sat behind the desk in her office. Her mind raced, the events of the previous day replaying over and over. The arrest, the drugs, the feeling of betrayal that had settled in her chest. It was as if the walls of the courthouse were closing in on her, but Ava wasn't one to let fear dictate her actions. She had fought for justice her whole life, and she wasn't about to back down now. The phone on her desk buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a text message from an anonymous source. "They set you up. They've got evidence on Hunt. Watch your back." The words sent a chill down her spine, but they also sparked a fire within her. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had made enemies before, but this was different. This was personal. She knew she couldn't rely on the system to clear her name. It was up to her to take control. Ava picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "It's time," she said quietly. "Give me everything on David Hunt. I need to know everything." As she waited for the response, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. Her thoughts were clear now. The trap that had been set for her was no accident. David Hunt had done this before, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. The clock ticked on, each second feeling like an eternity. Minutes passed before the phone buzzed again. It was a video, a grainy recording of David Hunt making a deal with someone in a dark alley, exchanging something small and suspicious. The face of the person he was meeting was unclear, but the transaction was enough. This was the break she needed. Ava immediately started making calls, reaching out to the few trusted colleagues she had left. She knew she couldn't do this alone, not when the stakes were this high. Hunt had more power than anyone knew, but Ava had something he didn't: the truth. By the time the sun began to set, Ava had compiled everything she needed. It was time to turn the tables. She had planned her next move carefully, knowing that one wrong step could lead to disaster. She gathered her documents, placed them in a folder, and slipped it into her briefcase. She was done waiting. She had to act fast. The next day, the courtroom buzzed with energy. Ava entered the room with a calm demeanor, though inside, her heart raced. She had spent the night preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, planning her strategy. She was ready. David Hunt was already in the courtroom, standing with his usual smug expression. His colleagues gathered around him. As Ava took her seat, she could feel the eyes on her, the weight of the situation pressing down. But she was unfazed. This was her time. Her chance to show the world that justice wasn't just about power, it was about truth. She stood up, her voice strong as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I request that the charges against me be dismissed immediately. I have evidence that proves these accusations are false." The room fell silent. David's smirk faded as he turned to face her. Ava reached into her briefcase and pulled out the folder. She walked toward the judge, her every step measured and purposeful. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as she handed over the documents, one by one. It was over. Ava had turned the tables. She had everything she needed to bring David Hunt down. The evidence was irrefutable, and soon, everyone in that room would know the truth. The truth that would expose him for the corrupt officer he was. Ava Turner had just turned the tide in her favor. And for David Hunt, the consequences would be far greater than he ever expected. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence, all eyes were on Judge Ava Turner. The evidence she had presented the previous day was irrefutable, and yet, she knew that the battle wasn't over. The weight of the room pressed heavily against her. The stares of her colleagues, the witnesses, and even the opposing counsel seemed to scrutinize her every movement. But Ava was no stranger to pressure. She had been fighting for justice her whole life, and this moment was no different. She could hear the whispers, the doubts, but she was done second-guessing herself. This was the beginning of the end for Officer David Hunt. She had laid the trap. She had exposed him. And now, it was time to ensure that the truth prevailed. The days that followed were filled with meetings, phone calls, and tense moments as the investigation into David Hunt unfolded. Ava had already handed over the proof, his corruption, his dealings, the undeniable evidence that painted him as the crooked officer he was. But Ava knew that the wheels of justice often turn slowly, and she had to stay patient. At the same time, Hunt was scrambling. He had tried to bury the evidence, to erase the trail she had uncovered, but the damage was done. His confidence, that smug arrogance he had carried with him for years, was beginning to crack. In the quiet of his office, alone with his thoughts, David couldn't escape the weight of what was happening. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and he would be left with nothing. But instead of stepping up and facing the consequences, he doubled down. David Hunt wasn't about to let a black judge take him down. He was going to fight, even if it meant digging himself deeper into the hole he had already created. But Ava Turner wasn't someone who could be intimidated, not by someone like him. She had faced far worse and had always come out stronger. As the trial loomed closer, Ava kept her focus sharp. She knew that Hunt would do everything in his power to delay, to distract, to manipulate the system, but she had already anticipated his moves. She had anticipated everything. The day of the trial arrived, and Ava stood in the courtroom, calm, composed, her eyes fixed on the front. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't going to back down. As the proceedings began, David Hunt's defense team launched into their opening statements, trying to discredit Ava, trying to paint her as biased, as someone who had an agenda. But Ava had prepared for this. Every accusation, every attempt to undermine her would fall flat in the face of the truth. She had everything she needed, and she knew that, in the end, the truth would win. As the trial unfolded, the walls began to close in on David Hunt. His lies unraveled piece by piece, and with each new revelation, his confidence continued to erode. The prosecutor's case was airtight, and there was nowhere left for Hunt to hide. Ava had delivered the final blow without uttering a single word. The room buzzed with anticipation as the jury deliberated. The clock ticked slowly, each passing minute adding to the tension in the room. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the verdict was announced. Guilty. David Hunt was sentenced to prison, his career destroyed, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. But for Ava Turner, the victory wasn't just about seeing Hunt pay for his crimes. It was about something much deeper. It was about justice, about standing up against the systems that had oppressed her and so many others. It was about showing the world that truth always prevails, no matter the odds. As Ava left the courtroom, she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been underestimated. Ava Turner had shown that even in the face of corruption and injustice, one person could make a difference. The days following the trial were quiet, but Ava Turner knew that the true battle was far from over. David Hunt's sentencing was just the beginning. She had exposed the corruption, but the fight for justice was always ongoing. The weight of the victory was still settling in, and while her colleagues expressed their admiration, Ava felt a profound sense of responsibility. The victory over Hunt was personal, but it was also for all those who had been silenced by the very systems meant to protect them. As she sat at her desk, looking out the large windows of her office, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. There were always more layers to the story, and she had a feeling Hunt was just a small piece in a much larger puzzle. Weeks passed, and while the public was still reeling from the scandal, Ava kept her focus sharp. She spent her time digging deeper into the network of corruption that she had started to uncover. She reached out to trusted contacts, piecing together the fragments of information she had, and what she found was unsettling. Hunt wasn't alone. The corruption ran deep, and the more she uncovered, the more she realized how far the rot had spread. She had taken down one person, but the system that allowed him to thrive was still intact. This realization didn't discourage Ava. If anything, it fueled her resolve. She knew she couldn't stop now. The truth had a way of bringing people together, and with each new piece of evidence, Ava felt like she was gaining momentum. One afternoon, as she reviewed documents in her office, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Judge Turner," a familiar voice said. It was Detective Marcus Daniels, one of the few people she trusted. He had been working quietly behind the scenes, digging into the connections between Hunt and some of the city's most influential figures. "You're going to want to see this," he continued, holding out a file. Ava took the file from him, her eyes scanning the pages as she read. What she saw was shocking. It wasn't just about Hunt anymore. This extended to powerful figures in the police department, the city council, and even business leaders who had been operating in the shadows. The web of corruption was far more extensive than she had imagined. But there was no turning back now. The battle was no longer just about exposing one corrupt officer. It was about taking down an entire system. With this new information, Ava knew she had the leverage she needed. But it would be a dangerous road ahead. The people she was about to go up against weren't just criminals. They were powerful, and they would do whatever it took to protect their interests. Still, Ava stood firm. She had fought her entire life for justice, and now, she was ready to take on the full force of the system. As the weeks unfolded, Ava and Marcus worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, preparing for the next stage of their mission. They knew they couldn't do it alone, so they began to build alliances with others who had been wronged by the same system. Slowly but surely, the network they were building grew stronger. The pressure mounted, but Ava remained steadfast. She had already proven that one person could make a difference, and now, she was determined to prove that the truth was stronger than any system built on lies. The walls were closing in on those who had once been untouchable, and Ava knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would finally come to light. The days leading up to the final stage of Ava Turner's mission were filled with calculated moves and quiet determination. She had spent years building a reputation as a judge who stood for justice, but now, it was her time to stand against a corrupt system that had undermined everything she believed in. The alliances she had formed with those who had been wronged were growing stronger, and the pressure on the powerful figures she had targeted was beginning to mount. In her office late one evening, Ava sat with a stack of files spread out before her. The evidence was undeniable, and the strategy for the next move was clear. She had already exposed David Hunt, but now she was preparing to take on the entire network that had allowed people like him to thrive. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Marcus. "Ava, we've got a problem," his voice crackled through the line. "The leaks have started. Someone's trying to sabotage everything we've worked for." Ava's heart skipped a beat. She had anticipated resistance, but this was different. The information was too sensitive, too crucial. They were getting closer, and the people at the top were getting desperate. "What do you need me to do?" Ava asked, her voice steady. "We're going to keep moving forward. We can't let them derail us now. I've got a meeting tomorrow with the Attorney General. It's time to push this to the next level." As she hung up the phone, Ava knew the stakes had just gotten higher. There was no turning back. The people she was fighting against had too much to lose. The following day, Ava met with the Attorney General, a trusted ally who had been following the case from the shadows. As they sat across from each other in a quiet conference room, Ava laid out her plan. We need to make this public. We've already exposed Hunt, but this isn't just about him. It's about the entire system that protected him. If we don't take action now, nothing will change. The Attorney General listened carefully, nodding in agreement. We've been gathering evidence from all sides. We can take this to the press, but we need to be prepared for the fallout. Once it's out, there's no going back. Ava's resolve hardened. I've been fighting for this moment my whole life. Let's make sure the truth finally comes out. As the meeting concluded, Ava felt a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt before. The battle wasn't just about exposing a few bad actors. It was about creating a shift in the system, about ensuring that those who had been silenced were finally heard. That evening, as Ava prepared for the press conference the next day, she thought back to everything that had brought her to this point. The years of hard work, the challenges, the moments of doubt. She had come so far, but there was still more to do. The world was about to see the truth, and Ava Turner was ready to face the consequences, whatever they may be. The next morning, as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Ava stepped up to the podium. Her voice was calm, but there was power in her words as she addressed the public. Today, we begin the process of taking down a corrupt system that has allowed those in power to abuse their authority for far too long. The truth will come out, and justice will prevail. The room went silent as her words sank in. Ava had done it. She had exposed the network of corruption, and the world was finally paying attention. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Ava felt the weight of the system shift. The battle for justice had only just begun, and Ava Turner was ready to lead the charge. As the press conference concluded, Ava Turner felt a deep sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The cameras were still flashing, the questions still coming, and her fight was far from over. The weight of her words echoed in the room, but she knew that the real work was just beginning. The story was out there, and now the entire system she had fought against was on high alert. She had made the first move, but it was only a matter of time before the backlash started. Ava spent the following days under the spotlight, her every move scrutinized by the media, but she had prepared herself for this. The road to justice was never easy, and she was no stranger to being in the crosshairs of those who would do anything to protect their power. She met with her team frequently, strategizing the next steps in her fight. The information she had uncovered about the corruption within the police department, the city council, and beyond was explosive, and Ava knew that they had to proceed carefully. Every document, every piece of evidence, had to be airtight. There could be no room for error. Marcus Daniels, the detective who had become her trusted ally, had been working overtime to track down the remaining links in the chain. We've got some new intel, Marcus said one evening as he entered her office, looking both exhausted and determined. I think we've finally connected the dots between the mayor and the people who've been backing Hunt. Ava looked up, her expression steady. What do we have? Marcus placed a folder on her desk. It's all in here. The mayor's office was in on it from the beginning. They helped cover up the corruption, gave Hunt the green light, and kept the public in the dark. They've been funneling money into secret accounts. Ava leaned forward, scanning the documents quickly. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was finally coming into focus. This wasn't just about Hunt anymore. This was about exposing the people at the very top who had manipulated the system to protect their own interests. Ava knew the fight was about to get even harder. The stakes were higher, and the people she was going up against were not only powerful but ruthless. We need to go public with this, Ava said, her voice calm but unwavering. It's time to bring the mayor into this. If we can expose him, the entire network will collapse. Marcus hesitated for a moment. Are you sure about this? Once we do, there's no going back. Ava nodded. I've been sure for a long time. It's time to take them down, once and for all. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and late nights spent preparing for the biggest move of Ava's career. She knew that exposing the mayor would put her at odds with some of the most powerful people in the city, but she was ready. As the day of the next press conference approached, Ava felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was it, the moment when everything would change. The world would finally see the depth of the corruption that had been allowed to fester for so long. When the day arrived, Ava stood at the podium once again, her face calm, but resolute. "Today, I'm here to expose the truth," she began, her voice carrying through the room. "The corruption that has plagued this city is deeper than anyone could have imagined. We have evidence that ties the mayor directly to the actions of Officer David Hunt and a network of corruption that spans across multiple levels of government." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Reporters scrambled to take notes, and cameras flashed. Ava knew that the pieces of the puzzle were finally in place. The fight for justice had entered a new phase, and she was ready to take on whatever came next. The mayor's name would soon be tarnished, and with it, the web of corruption that had protected him. For Ava Turner, the mission had always been about more than just one man's downfall. It was about creating a shift in the system, about showing the world that the truth could not be hidden forever. And with every step she took, she was getting closer to that goal. The weeks after Ava Turner's explosive press conference were filled with both triumph and tension. The city was in shock, the mayor's name being dragged through the mud, and the full extent of the corruption that had been covered up for years was starting to unravel. Ava had done what many thought was impossible. She had exposed the truth, but as the world's eyes turned toward her, the pressure to see this through only increased. The phone rang late one night. Ava picked up, recognizing the number immediately. "Ava, it's Marcus," said the voice on the other end. "I need you to come down here. We've got a problem." Ava's pulse quickened. "What's going on?" "It's the mayor. He's not going down quietly. He's making moves to protect himself, and it looks like they're trying to plant evidence to discredit us. We need to act fast." Ava took a deep breath. She had anticipated some sort of retaliation, but hearing it so directly made the danger feel all too real. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The urgency in Marcus's voice only confirmed what Ava already knew. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about survival. As Ava walked into the dimly lit office where Marcus was waiting, she could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. He handed her a file. "This just came through. The mayor's team is already working on shifting the narrative. They're trying to turn the public against us." Ava scanned the documents quickly. There it was, an attempt to discredit her. False claims that she was part of a personal vendetta against the mayor, allegations that she had manipulated evidence to further her career. "They won't get away with this," Ava said, her voice steady. She was no stranger to adversity, but this felt different. The stakes were higher. The fight wasn't just for justice now. It was for her career, her integrity, and the very foundation of the legal system she had sworn to protect. Ava knew that the only way to win was to stay ahead of them. The truth was on her side, but she couldn't afford to sit back and wait. "We need to get ahead of this," she said, turning to Marcus. "I want a full press statement ready. We expose everything, not just the mayor, but his network. Every link in this chain has to be broken." Marcus nodded. "I'll get to work on it right away." Ava's mind was racing. She could already see the fallout, but she also knew that if she hesitated now, the opportunity to put an end to this corruption would slip away. The next morning, Ava stood before the cameras again, but this time, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't just about exposing the mayor. It was about clearing her name, about proving that the fight for justice was bigger than any individual. Her voice was calm, unwavering, as she addressed the public. "Yesterday, I stood before you to expose the corruption within our city's leadership. Today, I stand before you not only to continue that fight, but to make it clear that the truth cannot be buried. The claims against me are false, and I will not allow them to tarnish the work we've done. This is bigger than any one person. This is about the future of justice, accountability, and the rule of law." As Ava spoke, she could feel the weight of the moment. The stakes had never been higher, but she was resolute. This wasn't just about winning. This was about changing the system. The press conference had the desired effect. The public's support for Ava grew stronger as more people began to see through the mayor's desperate attempts to protect himself. But Ava knew that this battle wasn't over yet. The mayor would fight back, and his allies would do everything they could to salvage their power. But Ava was ready. She had already taken on the most powerful figures in the city, and now, there was nothing left to stop her. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The people who had protected the corrupt system for so long were being exposed one by one, and Ava knew that this was just the beginning. The truth had been unleashed, and there was no going back. As Ava walked out of the press conference room, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Ava Turner felt like the system was finally starting to change. In the weeks that followed Ava's latest press conference, the city felt as if it were holding its breath. The mayor, now fully exposed, tried to salvage what was left of his power, but the momentum had shifted. Ava had made it impossible for the people to ignore the corruption, and with every new detail that surfaced, the walls around those responsible for the web of deceit began to crumble. But Ava knew that while the public was on her side, there was still much more work to be done. The people behind the corruption weren't going down without a fight. They had too much to lose. Late one night, Ava sat alone in her office, poring over the latest reports. The investigation had picked up steam, and the evidence was clearer than ever. The mayor's office had been involved in more than just covering up Hunt's crimes. They had orchestrated an entire campaign of corruption, involving key figures in law enforcement and even some powerful business leaders. The names were familiar to her, people she had seen in the courtrooms and boardrooms. But now, they were enemies to justice, and Ava knew that it was her duty to bring them all down. She called Marcus. "We need to bring this to the next level. I want a full public investigation into these connections. We can't stop now. If we want real change, we need to dismantle the entire network." Marcus's voice crackled through the phone, a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "I agree, Ava, but we're walking a fine line here. These people are powerful. We need to be careful." Ava paused, the weight of his words settling in. She had known this wasn't going to be easy, but she had come too far to turn back. "We've come this far. The truth is on our side. We have to push forward." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, calls, and planning. Ava and her team carefully coordinated their next steps. They knew that the media had already turned on the mayor, but now, it was time to expose the entire network. There was no room for error. The mayor's allies in the business world were just as culpable, and Ava had every intention of ensuring that they faced the consequences of their actions. As Ava stood at the front of the room during another press conference, her nerves were steady. She had done this countless times before, but today felt different. Today, she was not only exposing corruption, but she was calling for a full reckoning. "Today, we stand at a crossroads," she began, her voice strong and clear. "The system that was built to serve the people has been used to protect the powerful. But no more. We will not allow corruption to reign. We will dismantle it, piece by piece, and we will rebuild a system that serves everyone." The room was silent as she spoke, the gravity of her words hanging in the air. The stakes had never been higher, and she knew that her next move would determine the future of the city. "We have gathered evidence that implicates not just the mayor, but also members of the city's law enforcement and business leaders. These people thought they could get away with their actions, but they will face justice, and we will hold them accountable." As Ava finished her statement, the room erupted with questions. Reporters pushed forward, eager to learn more. But Ava stood firm, knowing that the time for talk was over. The real work had begun. As she walked out of the room, Ava felt a sense of accomplishment, but she knew this was only the beginning. The battle for justice was far from over, and there was still much more to be done. But for the first time in a long time, Ava felt like she was on the verge of real change. The truth was out, and now, it was time to finish what she had started. As the investigation continued to unfold, the pressure on Ava Turner and her team increased. Every step she took, every piece of evidence she uncovered seemed to send shockwaves through the city. The mayor's allies were fighting back with everything they had, using their wealth and influence to try to shut down the investigation. But Ava was relentless. She had made a promise to the people, and she would not back down now. The walls around her were closing in, but she stood firm. Every day felt like a new challenge, as the corruption that had been hidden for so long began to surface. Ava's team worked tirelessly, piecing together the information that would expose the full extent of the network. They had already revealed the mayor's involvement, but now it was time to take on the other powerful figures who had enabled him. Ava had learned long ago that justice was never a straightforward path, but now, with everything on the line, she couldn't afford to falter. One evening, as Ava sat in her office, reviewing the latest reports, Marcus walked in with a look of determination in his eyes. "Ava, we've got something," he said, holding up a file. Ava's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked. Marcus opened the file, revealing a series of bank records and emails that linked several high-ranking business leaders to the mayor's illicit activities. "We've connected the dots," Marcus said. "These people have been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They've been laundering money, funneling it into off-the-books deals to cover their tracks." Ava took a deep breath. The pieces were finally falling into place. This was it. The evidence they had gathered was the key to bringing down the entire system. But Ava knew that exposing these people would not be easy. They would fight back, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. She had seen it before. But Ava also knew that the truth was powerful, and once it was out there would be no stopping it. The following day, Ava met with her team again. "It's time," she said. "We go public with everything. We've got the evidence. We've got the truth. And now, we make sure the world knows it." The decision was made, and the wheels were set in motion. Ava's team worked around the clock, preparing the evidence for release. It was a dangerous move, but it was the only way to ensure that justice would prevail. That night, Ava stood before the cameras once more, her eyes steady and focused as she addressed the public. "The time has come for accountability," she began. "What we have uncovered is a web of corruption that has been allowed to fester in the highest levels of our government and business sectors. The mayor is just one part of this system, but today, we expose the entire network. We will not be silenced. The truth will come out, and those responsible will be held accountable." As she spoke, Ava's voice rang with certainty. She had come so far, and she was ready to see this through to the end. The world was watching, and there was no turning back. The response was immediate. The media picked up the story, and the public began to rally behind Ava and her team. People who had once been silent were now speaking out, sharing their own stories of corruption and injustice. Ava knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope. The truth was out there, and it was finally being heard. The pieces of the puzzle were all coming together, and Ava Turner was determined to see that the system was dismantled once and for all. As Ava Turner walked out of the press conference, the weight of what she had just done settled over her. The room had erupted in a whirlwind of questions, the cameras flashing, the reporters trying to make sense of the bombshell she had just dropped. The truth was out there, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like justice was within reach. The response had been overwhelming. People across the city were rallying behind her, sharing their own stories, calling for the systemic changes they had been waiting for. Ava felt a sense of unity among the people, something she had not experienced before. It was as though the weight of years of corruption was finally being lifted, but Ava knew this was just the beginning. The mayor and his allies would fight back, but they were no longer the untouchable forces they had once been. The foundation of their power was crumbling, and with each new piece of evidence, their grip was slipping. Back in her office, Ava sat down at her desk, the constant buzzing of her phone a reminder that the battle was far from over. The calls from reporters, activists, and even her colleagues in the legal system were flooding in. Ava's team had worked tirelessly to put all the pieces in place, but now the real challenge lay in seeing the investigation through to its conclusion. She needed to be strategic. Every move mattered. A knock at the door broke her concentration. It was Marcus. His face was drawn, the fatigue from the past weeks clear in his expression. But there was also a glimmer of something else, determination. "Ava, we've got a lead. Another connection. It's bigger than we thought," Marcus said, handing her a file. Ava's heart skipped a beat. Another piece of the puzzle. She opened the file, her eyes scanning the documents. The new evidence linked some of the city's most influential businessmen to the corrupt dealings within the mayor's office. These were powerful people, untouchable, or so they had thought. But with the weight of the public's support behind her and the undeniable proof in her hands, Ava felt more confident than ever. She looked up at Marcus. "We push forward. We bring them all down. This is our chance to change everything." Over the next few days, Ava's team worked even harder, gathering evidence, preparing for the next round of revelations. They knew that the mayor's allies would do everything they could to discredit them, but the facts were on their side. The momentum was growing. Ava's next move was clear: expose the full extent of the corruption to the public. The city's powerful figures who had been in the shadows for so long would now be brought into the light. On the day of the next press conference, Ava stood before the cameras once again. This time, she was not just calling for accountability for the mayor. She was calling out the entire network of corruption that had fed off the city for years. "We have uncovered the truth," Ava said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "The corruption that has plagued this city has reached the highest levels of power. Today, we expose the full extent of the lies and deceit that have been used to keep the people in the dark. These are the people who have been controlling our city from behind the scenes. They thought they were untouchable, but today, they will answer for their actions." The room fell silent as the reporters absorbed her words. The gravity of what Ava was saying was undeniable. This was not just a fight against one corrupt individual. This was a fight to restore integrity to a system that had been broken for far too long. As the press conference ended, Ava felt the eyes of the world on her. She had taken on the most powerful figures in the city, and she had not backed down. But she also knew that the battle was far from over. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be those who tried to tear her down, who tried to erase the truth. But Ava was ready. The truth was on her side, and there was no turning back now. The foundation of the old system was crumbling, and Ava Turner was leading the charge to build something new, something better. As Ava Turner walked back into her office, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The press conference had gone as well as she could have hoped, but the fight was far from over. The system she had spent so much of her life trying to navigate had finally been exposed, but the powers she had just called out weren't going down easily. Ava knew the road ahead would be rocky, and the backlash from the people she had named would be swift. But she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, for every case that had been buried, for every person who had ever been overlooked by a system that was supposed to protect them. As her team continued to gather evidence, Ava found herself sitting alone at her desk, lost in thought. The truth was out, but now the real challenge was seeing it through. The mayor's office had begun to shift the narrative, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the investigation and painting Ava as a political pawn. She had expected it, but that didn't make it any easier to handle. A knock at the door broke her train of thought. It was Marcus. "Ava, we've got a problem," he said, his voice tense. "What's going on?" Ava asked, already knowing that something big was coming. "The mayor's office is going on the offensive. They filed a motion to dismiss the charges, claiming that the investigation was politically motivated. They're trying to discredit everything we've done." Ava sat up straighter, her mind racing. She had expected this, but the reality of it still hit hard. She had already faced the wrath of the system, but now, it was all out in the open, and the people at the top were scared. "What's our next move?" she asked, her voice steady. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then answered, "We fight back. We can't let them rewrite the narrative. We need to stay focused and keep pushing the truth. The public's already behind us. We just need to stay one step ahead." Ava nodded. She wasn't going to let the mayor or his allies drag her down. They had underestimated her, and now, she was going to prove them wrong. Over the next few days, Ava and her team worked around the clock, building an even stronger case. They knew that they couldn't just rely on the media to carry them. They had to hit back with more evidence, more facts, more undeniable truths that would make it impossible for anyone to ignore the corruption at the heart of the city's government. Ava didn't sleep much in those days, but she didn't mind. She had come too far to stop now. The stakes were too high, and she wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how powerful, stop her. Finally, the day came when Ava was called back to court. The mayor's legal team had made their move, but Ava was ready. She walked into the courtroom, her posture straight and confident, her mind focused on the task at hand. The judge called the session to order, and Ava's heart raced. This was it. The mayor's team launched into their defense, trying to paint her as a pawn in a political game. But Ava knew that the truth was stronger than any spin they could put on it. As her team presented the evidence, piece by piece, it became clear that the mayor's office had been behind the corruption from the very beginning. The evidence was irrefutable, and with each new revelation, the mayor's defense crumbled. Ava stood tall, knowing that the system was finally being held accountable. When the proceedings finally came to an end, the judge announced that they would review the case and make a decision. Ava could feel the weight of the moment, but she knew she had done everything she could. The truth had been laid out for all to see, and now, there was nothing left to do but wait. As she left the courthouse, Ava felt a sense of pride. She had fought for what was right, and no matter the outcome, she knew she had already won. The system was starting to change, and Ava Turner had been the one to lead the charge. The weeks following the court hearing were a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Ava Turner had put everything on the line, and now the entire city was watching as the legal system prepared to deliver its verdict. The pressure was intense, but Ava remained focused, knowing that no matter the outcome, the wheels of change had already begun to turn. The system she had been fighting against for so long had begun to crack, and the people were finally waking up to the truth. As Ava sat at her desk, reviewing the final pieces of evidence, she received a call that she had been expecting. It was from the judge overseeing the case. "Judge Turner, we have reached a decision. We'll be making the announcement tomorrow." Ava took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for so long. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm but filled with anticipation. She hung up the phone and allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. From the first time she uncovered the corruption to this very moment, Ava had known that the fight would be long and hard. But she had never wavered. She had faced down powerful forces and had come out stronger every time. The next day, the court convened, and Ava stood before the judge once again. The room was filled with tension as everyone waited for the decision to be announced. The mayor, who had once been so confident in his position, now looked anxious, his legal team visibly sweating as the judge prepared to speak. After reviewing all the evidence presented, this court finds that the mayor and his associates have been involved in a systematic abuse of power, the judge declared. The charges against Judge Ava Turner are hereby dismissed, and the mayor is to be removed from office immediately. A full investigation will be launched into the network of corruption surrounding him. A wave of relief washed over Ava as she absorbed the judge's words. The system had failed her for so long, but now, justice had finally been served. The mayor's reign was over, and the truth had prevailed. As Ava stepped out of the courthouse, she felt a sense of accomplishment, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. This victory wasn't just hers. It was for every person who had ever been silenced by a corrupt system. It was for every person who had been too afraid to speak out. But she also knew that the battle was far from over. The city was in the midst of a reckoning, and there were still many more battles to fight. The work was just beginning. Ava returned to her office, the weight of the decision sinking in. The phone rang again. This time, it was a call from a former colleague. "Ava, you did it. The city's behind you. There's talk of reforms, changes to how things are done. People are finally listening." Ava smiled, but it wasn't a smile of celebration. It was a smile of determination. "This is just the start," she said. "We've opened the door, but now we have to make sure it stays open. We need real change. We need to rebuild from the ground up." As the days passed, Ava worked tirelessly to lay the foundation for the reforms that were now inevitable. She met with other leaders, activists, and advocates, working together to craft a new vision for the city. It wasn't going to be easy, but Ava was used to hard work. She knew that true change required more than just exposing the corruption. It required action. And she was ready. The battle was far from over. But Ava Turner had made her mark. She had shown the world that one person could make a difference, and now, she was going to make sure that difference lasted. The truth had been heard, and justice was beginning to take root. In the months that followed, the city began to change. The victory Ava Turner had fought for, and won, was not just a personal triumph. It was a victory for the people. The reforms that had seemed impossible before were now being put into motion. The mayor's allies were either out of power or under investigation, and the corruption that had once been the backbone of the city's political landscape was slowly but surely being dismantled. Ava knew the process would take time. Reform was never instantaneous, but the momentum she had sparked was undeniable. As she sat in her office late one evening, going over proposals for new transparency measures in the city's government, Marcus entered. His usual determined expression was tinged with something new: hope. "Ava, we've got more support than ever," Marcus said, setting a stack of papers on her desk. "The reforms are gaining traction, and the people are ready for real change. But we need to make sure we don't lose this moment." Ava looked up, her eyes steady. "We won't. But the work doesn't stop here. We've started something big, but now we have to make sure it lasts. These changes need to go beyond just new laws. They need to become part of the city's foundation." Marcus nodded. "I agree. People are listening, and they're starting to believe in a new vision for this city. Ava took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the window. The skyline was bathed in the soft glow of the evening, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like the city was finally moving towards something better. She had spent years fighting the system, exposing the corruption, and bringing those in power to justice. But now, the hard work of building something new was beginning. The changes she had fought for would take time to fully take root, but she was determined to see it through. The challenges were far from over. There would always be those who sought to hold on to the old ways, those who would try to undermine the progress that had been made. But Ava was ready. She had already faced the highest levels of power, and she had come out on top. She had seen firsthand the strength of truth, and she knew it was stronger than any system built on lies. Over the next few months, Ava worked closely with community leaders, advocates, and experts to create the framework for the changes that would reshape the city. The focus was on transparency, accountability, and ensuring that the voices of those who had been silenced for so long were heard. Ava knew that real change would take time, but every step forward was a victory. She watched as more and more people got involved, standing up for what was right, just as she had done. She had started something, and now, it was growing beyond what she had ever imagined. The final breakthrough came when the first of the new policies, aimed at eliminating corruption and ensuring transparency, was passed. It was a moment that made all the years of struggle feel worthwhile. Ava knew that this was just the beginning. The work would continue, and the fight for justice was ongoing. But now, she wasn't alone. The people had risen, and together, they were rebuilding the system. Ava Turner had ignited the spark for change, and now, the flame was spreading. She had proven that one person could make a difference, but in the end, it was the people who would ensure that the change she had fought for would last. And as Ava looked out over the city, she knew that the fight for justice would never stop, because the truth, once unleashed, could never be contained.